Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's first session of LitFestX. We are joined with Sandip Roy, who's a senior journalist and writer currently based in Kolkata after having spent many years in San Francisco. He is a commentator on National Public Radio in the US, and he's been a senior editor with firstpost.com in India. His work has appeared in anthologies like Storywala, Contours of the Heart, The Phobic and the Erotic. His journalism has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Times of India, the Telegraph, and many others. Don't Let Him Know is his first book. And Sandeep, welcome to LitFestX.
Thank you very much.
So Sandeep, right off the bat, this is your first book, and are you keeping it a little autobiographical, or is it completely away from your own life?
I don't know very many people who have managed to write a first book which is completely away from their own life. We writers are basically thieves, and we steal from things we see around us, lives we see around us. And our own life is often the easiest place to steal from. It's the low-hanging fruit, as it were. So the book is not at all, Don't Let Him Know is not at all autobiographical, but there are definitely elements of my life and my growing up that have become part of the book. So there are probably anecdotes in there. There are phrases that characters say that come out of my memory and that are very real to me because they happened. But it all happened in a different context, which is the beauty of fiction, where you can take the known elements of your life, but you can rearrange them to be much more interesting than your own life is. My life is far more boring than the lives of the characters in my book.
Okay. And so tell us a little bit about how it happened. I'm sure it's always exciting, and there's a different thrill to get your first book published. So, what was the process like?
Everybody has a first book story, and for me, what was unusual is that, in a way, the book happened to me. I was, at the time that it happened, I was not actually actively looking to get published. To sort of trace the chronology, I'd worked on much of this book while I was still living in the US, in San Francisco, where I joined, was part of a writer's group, and we would get together and share our writing and have potluck dinners. Sometimes the dinners were more interesting than the writing we were doing. But at that time, I was consciously sort of looking to get published. I sent the book around to some agents. And while I got good feedback, nothing really happened. And then I was in India. I moved to India, and I was working as a journalist with First Post. And I had gotten involved with some of the literature festival scenes here, more as a journalist than as a writer. And that's how I encountered Dia Kaur Hazra, who was then with Bloomsbury, India. And she sort of asked me whether she'd read some of my work, a story that had appeared in another anthology. And she asked me whether I had anything longer, any book that I was working on. And I was like, yeah, sort of, I have this book that's sort of lying around on my computer that I've been fiddling with. And she asked whether she could read it, with some trepidation, since we kind of knew each other. What if she hated it? And as it turned out, she really liked the book. And before I knew it, I had a contract for the book to be published in India, USA, and UK. And what was wonderful about it was, I always say that the book would not have been written if I had not been living in the United States. But the book would not have been published if I had not moved back to India. So in a way, I say there are two Cals in my life, California and Calcutta. And in a way, the book got published was a coming together of both those Cals. So that was wonderful and fortuitous.
That's a very interesting take, Sandeep, on the two Cals you mentioned. Now, on the book itself, tell us a little bit about, the format. I know there are, the chapters are written like sort of short stories by themselves, but elaborate a little more.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, the book has, I would call it a novel in stories. And and the thing is, if you picked up the book and you just, read, and you looked at the index of content, and you said like, oh, there's a chapter called The Discipline of Haircuts. It's chapter number 4, but the title sounds interesting, and you wanted to read The Discipline of Haircuts. You should be able to read that chapter entirely as a standalone story without needing to know chapters 1, 2, and 3 before it. But if you read them in sequence, then the chapters, which are all about the same people at different points of their life, start to feed into each other and cast shadows on each other and inform each other. And then hopefully the whole thing becomes a sort of novel, because there are secrets and taboos in the story that get revealed over the course of different chapters. But not knowing those bits don't actually impede your understanding of any particular chapter. So each of the chapters is like a standalone short story. And in fact, many of them, not many, several of them have appeared in anthologies in some form or the other as a standalone short story. But taken together, they're a novel about the secrets and taboos that affect this one particular family whom I follow from their youth to adulthood across a couple of generations and across a couple of continents.
And was there any specific reason why you chose to sort of use this format, Sandeep?
No, there wasn't a, well, I'll tell you the actual way it happened was originally I had written some of these chapters as stories, and they had different characters in them. Some of them were written in first person, some of them were written in third person. And a friend who was obviously much more clued in than I was about my own work read some of the stories and said, but you're really writing about the same people. It's just at different points in their time. And at first I was rather taken aback and chagrined, in fact, because I thought I was, inventing this huge array of characters set in different countries in different periods of time. And I was a little almost embarrassed to find out that, in fact, I was writing about the same 3 people at different points of time. But once I realized that what I was doing was writing a novel in stories. And once I figured that out, it actually became a sort of really interesting exercise to myself to see if I could possibly write the whole book in this format, where each of the pieces is standalone, but like a jigsaw puzzle, it then fits together into a large book. And then it felt fun to me to realize that, a stray thing that one of my characters might say in chapter 6, if you read it just chapter 6 by itself, you would say, that person is saying this thing. But if you'd read chapters 1, 2, and 3, that thing acquires more significance because you're suddenly aware of a backstory behind what that person says. And in a book that is really about secrets and taboos within one family, these backstories become very important, because in our lives too, we spend a lot of time carrying these different stories within ourselves, which we don't reveal to everybody around us. There are some stories about us that your parents know, and some stories that a boyfriend or girlfriend or lover knows. And there are some stories that your school friends know. Nobody knows all the pieces of the stories that make you up. And this book, in a way, is sort of a tribute to the way we sort of compartmentalize our own lives into different stories. So all my characters are aware of some secrets that the others carry. And sometimes they're not aware of the secrets the other carries, but the shadow of the secrets fall on all their lives as they go along.
And did you find that when you were sort of developing the narrative, sort of chapter to chapter, was that more difficult because of this format?
There were certain challenges, definitely, because I mean, the simple logistical challenges that you had to remember, because the story moves back and forth in time. And so you had to realize at some point that, oh, a house that was green, my character grew up in a green colored house. In chapter 10, I had to remember that house was still green and not just turn it into a cream colored house, for instance. I had to remember, and the biggest challenge was, of course, that because even though each thing was standalone, each chapter was standalone, the characters were the same characters. So I had to remain true to them, so that, my character named Romola had to sound like Romola, irrespective of whether she was in a small town in Illinois in the US, or whether she was visiting her son in Silicon Valley, or whether she was, sitting at the breakfast table with her husband in Calcutta. She needed to sound like the same person. Whereas if they were standalone short stories, then there could be 3 different Romolas in the 3 different chapters, and it wouldn't matter. But here, if she didn't sound the same, even as she aged over time, then it would seem a little jarring for the reader. So those were a lot of the things that we had to keep track of. And, of course, keeping track of people's ages. And in fact, we had to keep track of people who died in the book, because there was a point where a minor character, perhaps Romola's father, is referred to as being dead. But then in another later chapter, there is a line where you suddenly realize, oh, Romola's getting married, and her father suddenly says something. And then you have to remember, oh, no, but he actually died when Romola was 6 years old or something like that. So you had to keep all those pieces in play, because you were right, because you had to think about it as a novel, even though as standalone short stories, it wouldn't have mattered whether that if a minor character was alive in one short story or dead in the other.
It's quite an interesting way of putting this narrative out there, I must say.
Thank you.
There are 2 sort of strong undercurrents in the book. One is, of course, one of the family secrets being about a gay person in the family. Right. And the second is that there's a lot of stuff about immigrants. So tell us about both these 2 sort of ongoing undercurrents in the book.
Sure. So to tell you a little bit about the book, it opens with a woman, a widowed woman, who is visiting her son in California. And the son has found a letter, a piece of among his mother's old things, an old letter, decades old. Actually, it's a part of a letter. And the son thinks what he has found is a letter from a former lover of the mother. And so he thinks he has uncovered a great family secret. But because he's lived in California and he's American, he wants to process this with his mother. And so he comes to his mother and says, he thinks it's a bonding moment for the mother, with the mother. But the mother, Romola, is actually shocked, because she thought that letter had been long stashed away. And in fact, it was a letter, and I'm not really giving a whole lot away in this because it comes out very quickly in the book. The letter was not addressed to her from her lover. It was a letter she had inadvertently opened decades ago, and it was meant for her husband. And it was from his lover. So the husband, Avinash, was a gay man who had ended up getting married, as happens to many gay men around the world, and especially in India, even today. I mean, there have been headlines recently, you might remember, in Delhi at Ames, where a young woman committed suicide after she discovered that her husband was continuing to have affairs with men. I mean, and this is 2015. My characters are from a few decades ago, when there were far less resources available to somebody who might be struggling with sexuality in there. So, but the point is that Romola had found this letter, and she had not known what to do with it. And she had just hidden it away. So that is the big secret in the family, and which the son, of course, is not even aware of. But it's a definite shadow that is cast between the parents' lives. And I wanted to explore it without being hugely judgmental. I did not want it to be a story about, and that's, I think, where the difference between somebody who's being an activist and someone who's being a writer comes up around, because I might have very strong views on a gay man who's deceiving a woman by getting married to him. But at the same time, for my character, Avinash, I had to be not sympathetic, but at least empathetic. And I wanted the reader to sometimes be in Romula's shoes and to sometimes be in Avinash's shoes, and understand that even for Avinash, it was definitely not a best of both worlds situation where he has the stability of wife and family at home, and maybe he can have surreptitious physical encounters with men elsewhere. So I wanted to explore it. This is not a book about homosexuality. It is really a book about a family in which there are many secrets, of which homosexuality is very much the elephant in the room. And the conundrum for Romula is that at one point she is confronted with the fact that her son thinks that she once had an affair with this man whom he knows as his father's friend and uncle. And she is quite unable to also tell him that, in fact, that's not true. It was the father who had the affair. So, she is caught between these secrets where she is both trying to protect the son as well as herself and her husband. So that casts its shadow throughout the book, and we go back and forth. And in a way, the book actually, because it moves back and forth in time, there is a section where the father, Avinash, encounters a more modern gay world in India today, the world of social media and internet and chat rooms and things like that. And he goes to a gay party in a way he would not have been able to when he was coming of age himself. And to me, it's also a poignant moment, because he has to realize when he's there that he's a man past middle age now in a gay party scene filled with young gay men who really don't have time for him. And so he is both around to witness the possibility of gay life in an Indian metropolitan city, but not really be part of it in the way he once could have been. So it must have been a wistful, poignant moment for him. And I wanted to touch on those aspects. And in the immigration aspect, there have been obviously many books written about the immigrant experience of going to America or England and so on and so forth. And there is some of that in my book too. But my book is also a story that is more prevalent today, which is about return to India, or R2I as they call it, because my characters, Romula and Avinash, go to America. And then after Romula discovers Avinash's secret, she can't stand being in America alone with him. And she feels that the only safe refuge she can have is back to the known familiarity of India. And so the whole family moves back to India. So in a way, it is also a story not just of immigration, but of re-immigration and adjusting to life back in India. Whereas the son, Amit, again, like many others around me, goes to America and has a job in Silicon Valley and all of that. But the mother, unlike many characters in immigrant stories, is sort of a double immigrant. She has moved once from India to America, then from America back to India. And then again, as a widow, after her husband dies, she, like many older people in India, has moved for a while to be with a son and his family in California.
Right. You mentioned quite about the conflict of the mother in terms of should she reveal to her son that in fact his father was gay. And clearly that's a very interesting angle you've taken in the book, because usually the subject of homosexuality in popular writing has only dealt with, siblings or children being, homosexual, and then they having to deal with family pressures, or how do they come out of the closet, etc. But I think this is a very unique angle where you've got the conflict of the mother in terms of protecting her son, protecting herself, and ensuring that her husband also is not sort of portrayed in a particular way. Off late, if you see, there's been a lot of a discussion in popular sort of press and in public about Section 377.
Right.
And so, do you think this story is absolutely well timed? I mean, and also, where do you think that if the story was, let's say, in today's day and age, would you have treated it differently? This exact same question that the quandary that the mother is facing, do you think her conflict would have been somewhat different?
Yes, I do think the conflict would have been somewhat different because there would have been greater visibility about the issue in the sort of social strata that Romola belongs to. In my book, when Romola first realizes this about the husband, she has no idea of where to turn to. There's not a support group. There's not an internet resource out there. She can't even, she can't even fathom going back to her own family and saying, I found this out about my husband, because she doesn't know the words for it and how to frame it. Now it is a different situation, where a group like the Humsafar Trust in Bombay, which has been working on LGBT issues for a long time, actually provides counseling service not just to gay men, for example, but also to the wives of men who have come out as gay in the course of relationship. So there is support for spouses and things that's out there right now, which didn't exist. But having said that, I have to say it's also kind of horribly true that many of the same pressures and the same pressures to get married and all of this apply just as much today as they did 20, 30 years ago. I live in Calcutta. I know people who perhaps have been quite out in the gay scene, have been seen in gay parties and all of that, who suddenly, turn 30 or something and get married, knowing, even if they were not leading any particular closeted lifestyle before that, they give in to family pressure and get married because they think everything will be okay as a result of it. And it's not just about Section 377. I mean, there is great social pressure that still exists. I mean, I talked about the case in Ames. I mean, this is a couple who are doctors. They're not coming from any kind of uneducated background without they're doctors, and yet this man got married to this woman, and this woman was so frustrated that she committed suicide instead of, thinking that maybe she could seek help, find a way out of this marriage. So all those pressures still very much do exist here. So while I think that a Romola today would have a lot more resources available to her in confronting this situation, I'm also afraid that a lot of the same pressures that forced my Avinash to get married in the book still exist on Avinash's today.
So clearly, you have really, I should say, very well used the lack of understanding of homosexuality back in those days, and you portrayed the sort of the conflict and the situation in a very apt manner, which would have happened quite closely in that day and era.
Right. Yeah, but at the same time, Kumar, I did not want this to be a coming out story about Avinash. So in fact, there is very little in there about, say, Avinash's struggle around. I mean, there are stories that deal with his coming to terms, realizing his sexuality. But for example, I very deliberately avoided a story where we get into Avinash's head at the moment that he's getting married, the pressure and the thing. And that is where my format worked in my favor, where each of the chapters, being a short story, could be like a vignette into their person's lives. And I could leave certain gaps there for my reader to fill in with their imagination as to what, once they know about Avinash, then they can imagine what he went through at the point when he decided to get married. But I deliberately avoided that story, telling that story, because I felt like it would become a sort of woe is me victim kind of story about, like, that there was nothing sort of surprising about, unfortunately and sadly, there's nothing surprising about the kind of pressure people go through and when they yield and succumb to that pressure to get married. But to me, the surprise and the more interesting thing was, in the West, we think about coming out as a very singular process where it's a very individual decision. You come out, I am gay, I am lesbian, or whatever, I'm transgender. But here in our society, coming out is a much more familial process. And I would sometimes joke that in India, if you come out of the closet, the entire family goes back into the closet with you as a reaction, because it's all about like, oh, don't tell so-and-so chachi, don't tell that mama, hopefully the neighbors won't find out. So in a way, I wanted to explore the repercussions of what is his individual decision on getting married, for example, and the shadows that it casts not on him so much as on the rest of the family that's around him that has to deal with the impact of that decision.
Very, very interestingly, Sandip, you've clearly written the book in a very lovely way and also brought about some of these issues in a very fantastic fashion there. We've come to the end of the session. I'm seeing some questions coming for you on Twitter.
Okay.
We'll probably take one or two of them.
Sure.
So this one says, it's from Mehzabeen, and she says, accepting your sexual preference is one thing, following it is another. How do the characters in the book deal with it?
Mehzabeen will have to read the book to find that out. But I would say that, they deal with it not very well. I mean, in my case, for example, Avinash's character, in fact, does get married to a woman. So in a way, he's really chosen not to deal with that aspect of himself. But there is another character in the book, Sumit, who was, as it revealed, who is the one who wrote that letter, was a sort of a boy, a lover from when he was a young man. And we get a glimpse into Sumit's life where he has chosen not to get married, where he is in a relationship with another man. And we get a little glimpse of his life as well. And so there is a scene where Avinash and Sumit, once upon a time lovers, meet in Calcutta on the rooftop of an old house where they probably once used to hang out a long time ago. And you get a glimpse, and they're talking about their lives. And so you get a glimpse of how two different people have dealt with the same conflict that they had around sexuality. And that's why, Avinash is not a poster child for gay men in India, nor is Sumit. It's just a way of showing that everyone deals with it in their sort of own bumbling way, as the way they. And the basic thing is, some of us don't have the courage to deal with it, and some of us don't have the courage to hurt our families and parents and feel that the blow that coming out would cause to a mother or grandmother would be too much, and then they succumb to the family pressure.
Right. We'll take one last question. It says, personal life comes first and social responsibilities afterwards. What do you have to say about that?
I think, that's always a tricky balancing act that we play in this country. And I think most of us, having lived both in the United States and in India, I would say in India, definitely, most of us are raised with the feeling that social responsibility actually comes first, and personal life often has to take a back seat to that. And in that sense, my character of Romola, once she finds out about her husband's sexuality, has to deal with the fact, people would say, why didn't she just walk out of the marriage? But she didn't, because there is a certain social responsibility she felt she had accepted as a result of getting married, and she wanted to somehow make it work. And I didn't want my Romola to be a victim of that social responsibility. She took a decision to stay in the marriage. And over the course of the book, I did not want Avinash to be a villain as well. And over the course of the book, I wanted to show that even in that relationship, imperfect as it is, based as it is on a lie and a secret, there can still be moments of tenderness and affection that comes from two people who get to spend time with each other.
True. Very, very well put, Sandeep, I must say. And thank you so much for joining us on LitFestX. If you
Right.
have a message about the festival to our viewers, that'll be lovely. Please go ahead.
I would say this is my first time doing a virtual lit fest, and I think that right now the time is ripe for a lit fest to be virtual, because until now you had to go to every city to attend a lit fest, but now you can attend it from your armchair at home. And what better way to enjoy books than being in your armchair at home? And now you can get a world of lit fests as well.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Sandeep, and we wish your first book all the success. We hope to see it in the list of bestsellers soon, and more power to your writing.
Thank you. As they say, do let them know.
Sure, absolutely. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.